Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from Newsroom Pro, and welcome to a chat about what our economy could or should look like post COVID-19. Thank you very much, Rod, for coming on to this Zoom chat today. Rod Drury in Havelock North at the moment. Hello, Rod.
Hey Bernard, how are you?
Great. Now, in your op-ed a few weeks ago, you talked about one thing in particular, this idea of the government being involved in a nationwide rollout of 5G infrastructure. Rod, could you talk firstly about what struck you about this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we've learned through this COVID crisis with everyone working from home is what we did with UFB, getting that market structure right, break the chicken and egg, means that, we can do these sort of Zoom calls, right? I have a gigabit fiber connection to my home here, and it's absolutely amazing. And when you compare the internet we have to Australia and the US, it's just so much better. So it seems to me we've got this new big investment coming in. Everyone's talking about 5G towers. So why wouldn't we have the same model? And one of the things that I learned when I was doing Zero and understanding more about the funding of technology and different funding providers, one of the interesting things about telcos and infrastructure is that you're trying to blend two quite different things. If you have a company that is wanting to create value for shareholders, then you're always fighting about trying to do the public good, putting good infrastructure, getting services out to the regions where it's less, there's less return on those things. So one of the things I've been thinking about is how do you get the financing structure right to get the best outcomes for the country? And so if you think about infrastructure, and especially if you're going to put a whole lot of new infrastructure into our existing cellular network, what you want to do is create the situation where it's logical that you just keep rolling it out. And the vision that we should have is trying to have the best mobile networks, the best mobile network in the world that allows you to do great things. So I think the secret to that is to get the funding right. And if you think about rolling out this big tower investment as infrastructure, there are big super funds around the world that are looking to put $5 to $10 billion to work, and they don't need to earn a massive return to shareholders. What they want to get is a stable rate of return, maybe 4 or 5%. So say this thing cost a few $1 billion to roll these things out. And if we get the structure right, so that one company has that infrastructure investment, it can go and roll that out. And then what that means is that any retail provider can provide cellular services over the top, and they would contribute a regulated amount back into the fund that puts the infrastructure there. So say it's $5 a month. When I last looked at doing Pacific Fiber, I think we had 2 million mobile phones. I'm sure it's a whole lot more. And with 5G, we turn on the Internet of Things opportunity. So we have all sorts of sensors and things, sending things around. If you start multiplying however many devices there are by, $5 a month, then you can see how we fund that infrastructure investment. And then what I think will happen is, yes, we'll start at the very obvious places, so the densely populated places, but then rather than having to have a separate a regional UFB program like we used to have, you just logically, with the super profits that come in from all those millions of $5 per month, you start rolling out more and more fiber to the provinces, to tourist hotspots, so that we can have this amazing lifestyle where we just turn on these magical devices and we can be creating content, doing video conference calls, connecting, doing telemedicine, all of those sort of things. So I reckon everybody wins. The big infrastructure super funds have a really stable investment where they can get maybe 4.5% on their money, and there's a big demand for that. New Zealand can become this amazing place with great infrastructure right throughout New Zealand. And then we'll see a whole lot of new telcos and the existing ones, Vodafone and Spark, who can really focus not on that kind of hard to obtain capital to roll out infrastructure. They can, they are basically marketing and service companies, and they can then put their resources into great products and services over the top.
So, Rod, that's a really compelling idea. But I'll bring Hamish in now here, who's day in, day out working in the telco industry, and Spoiler alert, actually, a long time ago, you and I were on an executive team together at Telecom Wired. So you really know the telco sector and how it's changed over the years. Hamish, can you explain for me, how come this isn't going to happen with Vodafone and Spark, who are big companies? They've helped build two pretty strong 4.5G networks. Why can't they do exactly the same with 5G so that all of us could use their networks?
Yeah, no, good question, Ben. And I think it probably comes back to Rod's point about the tension and conflict that I guess can happen with private sector dynamics and investors trading off, I guess, meeting the needs of investors versus the needs of Kiwis, homes and businesses. And, the I guess, cost of entry and barriers to entry are, I guess, quite prohibitive. And we are only going to end up with one or two, dare I say it, networks in New Zealand. And what that means is if we don't have some form of, I guess, regulatory involvement here, it could spell the return to, I guess, the bad old days of telcos in a duopoly type situation, perhaps taking advantage of their power. And I say that, Bernard, on the back of what we've enjoyed over the last decade. We've had successive governments come in and overhaul the telecommunications sector. And we have UFB, the fibre network, which is the envy of many a Western world country and no less our Aussie cousins. And New Zealanders are enjoying the benefits of a network that sort of reaches 85% of New Zealand homes and businesses. And we've, the COVID-19 situation has only highlighted how lucky we've been, because, dare I say it, you step outside the densely populated metros of Australia, it'd be pretty hard to have some of these, use some of these tools like we're using today.
Yeah, but why is it that we can't have the current three networks, so Spark, Vodafone and 2 Degrees, why can't they just roll out their own 5G networks? They didn't need any help to do their 4G networks. What's different about 5G?
Yeah, look, the government and the Commerce Commission did undertake a review of mobile as a part of the broader telecommunications sector last year. And they were of the view that there was no evidence of market failure at a wholesale level with these three players. Now, I would beg to differ. Yes, we've got three mobile network operators in New Zealand and maybe half a dozen or 8 retailers of mobile with their own brands. But when you look at UFB, we've got over 180 retailers of UFB in New Zealand with one network. That would suggest to me there has been some sense of market failure, and we're seeing the pricing benefits, the service benefits, and a level of innovation happening on our fixed infrastructure that makes what's happened in our mobile infrastructure pale in significance. So, the fact is also yes, we have a third network, and up until 10 years ago, and that's 2 Degrees, it was just Vodafone and Spark, or formerly Telecom. And read between the lines, but our pricing levels are 1/3 of what they were only 10 years ago, and the economics haven't changed.
And the difference to me, it seems, is that to build a 5G network costs 4 to 6 times what it would cost to build a 4G network. And that's because you need a lot more towers and boxes to direct all the beams of data exactly where they need to be. So it's quite a different scale of infrastructure build for a 5G network versus a 4G. So that increases the amount of capital that you need and makes it more difficult for a new competitor to come in. And then the third part is that 2 Degrees was effectively vendor financed for all its gear by Huawei, which we now know the government is reluctant to allow Huawei to build or have the big boxes at the center of the network, and currently is not involved in the 5G rollouts for Spark and Vodafone. So it seems very unlikely, at least for now, that 2 Degrees will be able to provide its own 5G competitor. And those much higher capital costs mean that the economic case for Spark and Vodafone to roll out 5G as a truly national network, it'll be really difficult to get those 5G services. So places the likes of Napier or Whanganui or New Plymouth or Timaru or Westport and Whangarei, they're not going to get 5G services if we allow the current trajectory of regulatory intervention and private sector investment continue, particularly at the moment where investment thresholds and investment appetites by private companies are going to be constrained by COVID-19. So, Rod, could you give us a sense of what that government intervention could look like in terms of types of regulation or types of investment? You talked about the super funds providing the funds, but how do we make sure there's that nationwide rollout and that the super funds have that 4.5–5% regular return?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's it's exactly the same as what we did with UFB. It's getting the structural separation. It's separating retail services and making that an open playing field so people compete to provide good service. And we see lots of innovation happening at that layer. And then, similar to UFB, I think we put the funding in place. And after the article we wrote, I've had lots of inbound from super funds and from cellular network investors around the world really interested in this discussion because they need to deploy capital. But I think we do it in such a way that there is a public good charter. So if we're going to say, look, what probably has to happen is potentially you buy all the tower networks back, put it into a single holding company, freeing up capital for the existing people. And then the charter of that organization, which would need to have a good, diverse board, is about is about setting what that price is and working with government on what the connection price is. Maybe it's $5 per connection per month, which I'm sure is probably cheaper than what the fully loaded price is now. And then the interesting thing is once that gets taken up, which could happen quite quickly, then the super profit that comes from that, how that gets spent around the network. So we don't have a rural program, we just have a New Zealand program and we push things out. And an interesting thing is who actually runs that, because there's an issue around fiber versus 5G substitution. Potentially that goes away. And we may also, it's interesting, Hamish's businesses now started doing fixed point wireless. There may be other technologies that we put into that network, but we start with what is the vision for New Zealand. I think it should be the best mobile connected country in the world, where you just, it's just like oxygen. There's your phone and you can, send videos, do video conferences from almost anywhere, tell people about our great country, but also connect to the globe. So if you start with that vision, then I think everything pops into place. And I think what's really interesting is actually having that open conversation with Spark and with Vodafone, because I think this is a massive win for them as well. So one of the things that we've talked about is actually, rather than waiting for government, who do find this stuff very difficult to lead on, is actually have a conversation with the industry, get everyone around the table and just see if this is a stupid idea or an interesting idea, where the sensitive areas are, and actually start working through it. So we've started a program of work to have that discussion as well.
And Hamish, you've based your business in Napier, started in 2012 from memory, and you've employed dozens of people around the Hawke's Bay on pretty good wages to be engineers and people working in call centres, and they've bought themselves reasonably cheap houses, hopefully before the prices went up too much, and all that Hawke's Bay sun and the likes. Can you give us a sense of why it's important for 5G to be available in New Zealand's provinces and smaller towns and cities?
Yeah, I think you make a really good point around that risk around provincial and regional New Zealand. And because if it is in the private sector, investment dynamics will prevail. And I don't think it's a matter of necessarily if, but it will be a very long time before regional and provincial New Zealand benefit. And I really like Rod's idea of a treating it as a national network. And hey, and so you're kind of getting unders and overs in terms of the economics, but everyone benefits. But why is it important to provincial and regional New Zealand? Look, it's never been more important. We're going into a recession that we haven't seen for 100 years, and the provinces and regions of New Zealand are going to get hit hard. We know they don't bounce back as quickly. Why is it important? It's on a whole lot of levels. A lot of our primary production comes out of provincial and regional New Zealand, and 5G has a massive role in enabling these operators in these sectors to be more globally competitive. I think there's been, and we've seen this evidenced in recent weeks, a growing social digital divide, I guess, evolving in New Zealand. So we have those lower socio-economic suburbs and so on pocketed throughout New Zealand who don't have access to high-speed internet. The nature of UFB and the way it's been structured and the costs and so on has made it prohibitive for the retailers to wear that risk. So there's some real social benefits here as well, and this is a real growing issue for New Zealand to bridge this growing divide, and these people need access to all the tools that those less, I guess, disadvantaged are getting access to. The third thing I'd have to say is, and this is a New Zealand thing, 5G stands to help us with how we manage this environment. And that's got to be New Zealand's greatest point of difference in terms of the authenticity of our brand moving forward globally. And 5G will make us do that more easily.
So Rod, you're a bit of a tech expert and certainly you're up with the play with the latest on different types of technology. Can you, for a wider audience, explain why 5G can change businesses and change economies? Because a lot of people at the moment may see 5G as just like 4G, but faster and more Netflix I can download.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's really exciting about it is doing the things that we're doing now, right? Being able to connect anywhere. So at the moment, I'm stuck to my desk. And what 5G gives us is basically fiber in our hand as we're walking around. You think about the example of trying to get kids on the internet this week, where what connection do you have at your home? Do you have a Wi-Fi router? Now, what you'll be able to do with 5G is basically, you can go to a whole bunch of houses with kids that may not have access to those services. And as long as there's a 5G tower there, they can get access to that. The other big thing is what's going to happen with the Internet of Things, where you have a whole lot of smart devices all around. We could be monitoring things like water quality, all those environmental issues with very low cost sensors, which are just pinging small amounts of information. So being able to have a smart economy makes sense. But I think the one that the idea that people can really get their head around is, imagine being able to be anywhere around New Zealand and being able to just have high quality video calling just by opening up your device. Hey, just to finish off, a question that I had for Hamish was, is 5G safe? There's a lot of talk about that. And surely if there's a single 5G network, does that mean there'll actually be less, you can run one network? I imagine you could have 2 or 3 boxes on every tower if there's multiple providers, right?
Yeah, really good question, Rod. As I understand it, it's safe, and there's been a lot of research, as I understand it, and we know the camps are divided on this, but there's many a device that puts out greater EMFs than 5G. But I think your point here in terms of this is just another reason why we need the government to get involved, because the last thing we want is 3 proprietary networks being beamed off every 5th street lamppost around New Zealand, because we are talking massive infill with 5G. You're going from 3 to 5 broadcast sites per square kilometre to about 25. So all the more reason why we just have one decent proprietary network running through New Zealand.
And of course, if you've got one network and it's a 5G network, those people in struggling communities, where previously to get internet access to them for schooling or training or health services or whatever would have required someone to get a physical connection to the internet and a USB connection probably, which is actually quite hard for everyone, as we've discovered.
Right.
And just imagine if you had that infrastructure there that was common across the country and which was accessible by all sorts of services companies and services organizations. You could have, for example, someone whose job it was, agreed with the government, let's say, to provide a device for every family who needed it that was already set up to connect up to that network.
Yeah.
And that $5 plus whatever it is would be much easier to deliver to those communities. And also, I think if you're a relatively small farmer or a small organization, being able to connect up through a multitude of services, thousands of companies and organizations, being able to piggyback on top of that common network with a common price would be a big thing. So
I just picking up on Rod's point as well, because this is almost like akin to the government letting State Highway 1 be privatised. Now imagine if we ended up with 2 other players coming in and said, yeah, we're also going to compete. Let's have 3 State Highway 1s running through New Zealand. It's actually no different. And we don't want the innovation to be happening at that level anyway. It's everything that sits on top of State Highway 1 that really matters to the Kiwi homes and businesses of New Zealand. And I guess the thing for me is, and Rod's touched on this isn't easy, but nothing worthwhile is easy. And it just kind of feels that the government's put this in the too hard basket over the last 2 or 3 years. And there's a massive appetite amongst the industry to actually work with the government and actually coming up with a solution that I guess provides the sort of regulatory certainty that investors are looking for and will benefit Kiwi homes and businesses.
Particularly now. I mean, there is this saying that you shouldn't waste a good crisis. And also it's clear from what's happening in the economy and what the government's trying to do that now is the time more than any when national infrastructure projects are needed, ones that will improve productivity and connect up those who are digitally excluded. Now is the time to look at something like that. And if we can present ourselves as not only the most COVID-free place in the world, but the one that has been best at effectively digitizing itself to a very high level right across the country, we become an attractive place to work. We deal with this real problem we've had over the last decade, which is stagnant productivity and real problems in the regions. And you can see that all parties, all sides of Parliament, you've got New Zealand First, who love to invest in the regions. You've got National, who invested in a UFB network, and you've got Labour, which broke up telecom. All 3 of those parties, you'd think, could see some sense in something like this.
I think the key thing is we now need to have the discussion. So there's lots of ideas flying around. So what's the mechanism? So I think there's a mandate now for Chris Farfoy to get the industry in the room. If he doesn't want to do that, I think there's enough of us working to get the industry room to just work it out and then maybe go to government to do their piece. But I love the idea of not requiring taxpayer funding. What we're doing is getting the market architecture right so that potentially everybody wins.